Teal Deer. Assertions! Assertions everywhere, and not a single shred of evidence nor study to be found. So yeah, someone sent me a link to this video, and I'm going to have a look at it. Let us go on, shall we?
There's a lot of talk about the sexism against women in video games. Women are used as tropes, they're hypersexualized, and rarely are they accurately represented.
I'm sure you have some very compelling evidence to back up these claims, and a massive list of sources. Oh.
What's not often discussed, however, is why these depictions are a problem.
Would you say that they are problematic?
My name is Misty Berlin, and in this short video, I'm going to explain why misrepresenting females in games is such a big deal, and the negative effects doing so has on gamers and the characters themselves.
And you're going to do all that with no sources or evidence whatsoever. What could possibly go wrong? I just hope that a fedora-wearing, neck-bearded, man-child, supreme gentleman of the internet doesn't spread his euphoria all over this video.
First, let's talk about how they're misrepresented.
You do realize that the inclusion of chiptunes in your video is not going to give you some sort of default credibility within the gamer community, and that you are still going to be judged by the content of your character and what you say, right?
A study done in 2010 found that of almost 500 video game characters analyzed, 86% were male. 86%! Last I heard, females take up about half the population and gaming community.
Let me just take a look at that study that you've sourced. Oh, right. Never mind, let me do the legwork for you then. So in my attempt to track down this elusive study of yours, I have found this, the Routledge Companion to Video Game Studies. And this is all going to get really confusing, so you're going to have to bear with me. In this book, the only reference that I can find to this is in a paragraph entitled Femininity in Games, Game Characters, and it is the second paragraph down. Male characters greatly outnumber female characters in video games, contributing to the characterization of gaming spaces as masculine. A large-scale multi-platform analysis of more than 8,000 characters across 150 video games found that only 15% of video game characters were female. That number drops to 10% for female main characters, citing Williams, Martins, and Consalvo and Ivory, 2009. And these results were consistent with earlier studies done by Dietz in 1998 and Downs and Smith 2010. So, from all of this, I'm guessing we're looking at that study from 2010 by Downs and Smith. A study by the name of Keeping Abreast of Hypersexuality, a Video Game Character Content Analysis. And the first thing that instantly stands out to me about this study is, while it was published in 2010, if you actually read into the abstract, you will notice that the original study was conducted in 2003, meaning the paper was published 7 years after the research was conducted. This instantly makes me very suspicious, and you might want to remember that later because it does come in handy. So keep that in your head. But now we're going to look at the other side of what she stated, that women are about 50% of the population and also 50% of the gaming community, both of which are true. However, we now need to concern ourselves with this thing called marketing and target demographics. Just because a certain type of person makes up a certain percentage of a market, that does not necessarily mean that you are going to see the same percentage of representation when the product is advertised or targeted to them. But I've kind of butchered a sentence there and made it particularly unclear. So let's look at some figures, and I'm going to explain why, even though women are half of the gaming audience, they are not half of the people that you see in games. So the first and most important thing that you need to keep in mind here is that while, yes, women make up the majority of people playing games, the kind of game that they are playing and the platform on which they are playing them is very important. So let's take a little look at this chart here from Flurry.com, who have actually looked at the breakdown of males to females and the types of game that they are playing. So this chart is gradiented from 0 to 100% female representation. So if a game is on the far left-hand side, it will be 0% female gamer. which basically means it would be 100% exclusively males that played it. The further to the right that you go, where you get to 100% female, obviously means that it is a 100% female, exclusively women playing that title. And the first thing that should instantly stand out to you on this chart is that women prefer playing games that do not have main characters. For example, games such as Solitaire, slot games, Match 3 or bubble shooter games. These are not games that have main protagonists. But then let's look at the other side of the chart at games played by males. Strategy games, shooter games, racing games, action RPG games. These are all games where you are controlling the action of another person. So they are games that actually have a protagonist figure. This simple difference alone explains why male characters would be more represented than female characters in computer games. It is simply a case of targeting your demographic. It is the same reason why products aimed at women are advertised by women. Anyway, moving on, I hope you still remember that thing about that previous study being actually conducted in 2003 as opposed to 2010, because it's really important here.
Similar statistics were reported in 2001 and 2002, which shows that in almost 10 years, very little progress was made in terms of egalitarian gender representation.
This is now massively disingenuous. In fact, I would almost go so far as to call it a downright lie, because a study conducted in 2001 and another one conducted in 2002 found similar numbers to a study that was conducted in 2003, yet not published until 2010. That doesn't mean that the numbers are still relevant nearly 10 years later. So what you've done here is you've taken figures that are different by a year and applied the difference to over a decade, when you have no proof that that is the case. Also, let's have a look at those 2001 and 2002 studies. Oh, yeah, that problem again. But once again, I am going to do some legwork for you, because there's something a bit suspicious about those numbers. It may very well have something to do with the fact that 73 and 13 do not add up to 100. And if we are talking about male to female representation, you would have thought that it would be 100% as the total, right? But as far as I can tell, this figure comes from an article called Fairplay, published by childrennow.org. And in this article, we do actually locate your missing percentage, in which they refer to those as non-human. The very fact that you wouldn't bother to actually disclose the entirety of these numbers, again, makes me very suspicious. And you know what else makes me very suspicious of this study? The fact that they have not a single citation within it. Even if you follow those tiny little numbers at the end of the figures. You know, those little numbers that you would expect to lead to the citation. They don't. Well, at least not on point 16 they don't. But needless to say, this is another article that goes on to complain about lack of female representation and lack of females as playable characters, while also ignoring the fact that women generally do not play games that even have characters in them. So basically, this is just a very lengthy paper full of assertions. So I can see why this girl would like it. Can I just point out at this moment that she has been speaking for less than a minute? And while all of her figures are technically accurate, they are being presented in an especially misleading fashion, in an argument that can basically be summed up with, I found some numbers I don't like, therefore patriarchy, as opposed to much more simple and likely explanations such as marketing demographics. But anyway, let's go on.
When females are in games, they're also likely to be hypersexualized. Hypersexualization refers to an overemphasis on sexual body parts and idealized body design.
Well, I hope you have some exceptionally compelling sources showing me that this is something that incredibly frequently happens within computer games. I mean, if it is so frequent, then it must be really easy for you to find loads of examples. I mean, terms such as sexual body parts is purely subjective, but there must be some sort of facts and figures to back this up, right? And while we're at it, I'm sure you're going to completely disprove the notion that any male character ever in any computer game has ever been subject to something such as an idealized body norm.
In the before-mentioned study, 41% of the female characters documented wore sexually revealing clothing, with only 11% of males clothed likewise. Females were also more likely to be depicted full or partially nude, with 43% of females and only 4% of males showing nudity. 25% of the female characters and only 2% of the males had unrealistic body proportions. Another analysis study found that, of the characters analyzed, 77% of the females had large breasts and emphasized buttocks.
Well, those figures certainly do sound shocking, don't they? But once again, you haven't actually explained which one of those studies contains those numbers. But if I had to guess, I would say it's probably the 2010 study. And while the 2010 study in its entirety is hidden behind a paywall, and frankly I'm not going to pay to get it, I have found another paper that is free that actually references it in quite some detail. And that paper is called I've Baked a Cake for You, and was published again in 2010. So let's jump straight on into the methodology used here, shall we? For this study, the researchers took the top 20 best-selling video games from 2003 for each of the Nintendo GameCube, Sony PlayStation 2, and Microsoft Xbox consoles. These games are listed below in Table 1. We will get to that shortly. 3 undergraduate students with gaming experience were randomly assigned 20 games and played each game for 20 minutes in single-player mode. The playing was recorded, and at a later date, 3 coders were randomly assigned to code the character attributes they found in the tapes. This study followed the advice of earlier studies, and only looked at characters that were primary, the characters could control them on screen, and secondary, characters immediately tied to gameplay by interacting with the primary characters. The characters were judged on 6 criteria. 1. Sexually revealing clothing. 2. Partial or total nudity. 3. Unrealistic body proportion. 4. Small waist. 5. Breast size. And 6. Inappropriateness of attire. Sexually revealing clothing is defined as any garment that is worn in order to enhance, exaggerate, call attention to, or accentuate the curves or angles of any part of the body, from the neck to above the knee, and which, by design, would arouse interest of physical intimacy from others. Now, I have to take a little bit of a break there. Arouse interest of physical intimacy. That is a hell of a subjective thing, isn't it? And surely that is going to depend very highly on the genders and orientations of the coders who are watching the footage. So already I'm seeing quite a large amount of potential subjective bias here. But anyway, moving on. Partial nudity was defined as exposing skin in an area that should be covered by clothing. And once again, I have to take a break here. Should be covered? By whose standards? By whose moral judgment? What should and should not be covered? I mean, surely this goes into what is appropriate for the activity, but again, who is to definitively say what is and is not appropriate attire for certain activities? Again, I'm just noticing a lot of potential here for subjective bias messing with the results here. Some examples are exposed midriffs and cleavage for women, shirtless males, exposed thighs, and/or buttocks for men and women. Inappropriateness of attire is defined as the degree to which garments worn by a character were suitable and functional with respect to the task at hand. For example, a woman wearing a bathing suit on the beach is appropriate, but a woman wearing one while competing in a dirt bike race is not. But once again, these people fail to realize that all of these things are incredibly subjective criteria. And the next part I find to be particularly amusing because all you have to do is look at this. The images above are screenshots from 2 of the video games that were tested: Dead or Alive, Extreme Beach Volleyball, and NBA Street Volume 2, respectively. The image on the left, Lisa, displays at least 4 of the hypersexuality indicators. She is partially nude, she has unrealistic body proportions, and a large breast size. While her clothes are sexually revealing, they are not considered inappropriate, as she is playing beach volleyball in the game. But this example hits perfectly home about how incredibly subjective this is, because I would not consider her body proportions to be unrealistic, nor her breast size to be overly large. Sure, neither of those things are particularly typical, but there are examples of women with those sorts of body shapes. While it is not common, it is not unnatural. And this kind of goes back to the subjectiveness of the statement that they were using earlier. Would this, by design, arouse interest of physical intimacy? Well, surely that is entirely down to the subjectiveness of the coders. What happens if all 3 of the coders have a hairy BBW fetish? Well, that would instantly discount this example as being in any way a sexual portrayal of women. And when we look at the games that they include, I am instantly very suspicious of a study that is looking at nudity and then includes a game such as Dead or Alive Extreme Beach Volleyball. Including that game alone is already going to massively sensationalize the figures, I would imagine. But let's actually look at the figures. Oh. Well, is it any wonder the category that featured a game with no playable male characters, in which every single character is a scantily clad female, has massively exaggerated results? Can we just declare this source to be debunked and all of these numbers to be stupid now? Because I've been speaking for a very long time, and I'm not even 2 minutes into the actual video. So yeah, let's just call this massive disingenuousness again.
Magazine depictions show similar trends. One study found that 60% of female characters and only 1% of male characters in game magazines were sexualized. 39% of females and only 8% of males were scantily clad.
Yeah, one study with no links, no citations, not even a date with which I can try and hunt it down. Can I just call this figure bullshit off of the bat? Because I'm going to.
Alright, I'm done throwing numbers at you.
Oh, thank God! Because I have spent more time debunking these figures than I think you actually spent researching them.
Just know that these are not the only studies that show the lack of female characters in games and their overt hypersexualization.
You're going to link to any of those studies? No, of course you're not.
And hypersexualization is a problem. Later we'll talk about the effects of hypersexualized characters on players, but for now I'm going to focus on what hypersexualization does to the character herself. By hypersexualizing a character, her personality, worth, and identification become locked with her appearance and sexual appeal. As the player enjoys her aesthetically and sexually, the character is transformed into an object of desire. Her persona cannot be separated from her body. And for a lot of female characters, her body is her most prominent feature, with her personality thrown in the background. Physical attractiveness also defines a new power for the character, which she shouldn't have to rely on. An attractive or sexy woman in a video game is allowed to have authority. Without this, she cannot be highly valued. Lara Croft, for example, was one of the first assertive, strong female characters that didn't rely on men. And, as most of us are aware, she was very hypersexualized. Until the newest installment in the series, Lara was curvaceously thin, with large breasts and a tiny waist. The developers of Tomb Raider have stated that their targeted audience was males from 15 to 26, so in order to appeal to them with this independent female, they made her very pleasing to look at. Now Lara has realistic body proportions and is very desexualized in comparison, but she still maintains a high level of attractiveness. Now I'm not saying that all females in games should be hideous or terribly displeasing to look at. After all, women have described feeling powerful while playing as Lara because she's smart, sexy, and independent. But hypersexualization turns characters into objects instead of subjects, undermines their personality, and changes the player's interpretation of the character. As in the real world, a woman shouldn't have to rely on her body or attractiveness as her most defining feature.
You got any proof for any of that stuff you just said? Or is this in fact just a massive list of assertions? Because surely the very fact that some women will tell you that they play as characters like Lara Croft and Bayonetta, and it makes them feel fucking awesome about themselves, should tell you that this supposed objectification of women does not have a negative effect on real women. In fact, they see it as something quite empowering. But let me guess, something internalized misogyny, something patriarchy, something donate to my Patreon, right? So needless to say, this video goes on for a lot longer. In fact, I've only done about the first 3 minutes of it, and it's about 12 minutes long in total. I think this is one of those videos that I might actually have to come back to because there is far too much to say about it. Honestly, it's like trying to pull apart a video by Anita Sarkeesian. You just have to debunk one assertion after another, after another, after another. So I think this is an excellent place to leave this with the simple message: Citation Needed!